If you had visited Coral Castle 60 years ago, you would have been greeted by a man weighing a mere 100 pounds, standing just over 5 feet tall. And he would have asked you for 10 cents and introduced you to the fantasy of a world carved out of stone. And as you moved around and looked around, you couldn't help but notice Edward Leedskalnin and his work. Since it's documented that no one really ever witnessed Ed's labor in building his rock park, some say that he had some strange powers indeed. Ed would only say that he knew the secrets used to build the ancient pyramids, and that if he could learn them, you could too. In a moment, our special guest tonight, Joe Bullard, on Coast to Coast AM. Joe Bullard was born in Florida in 1951. That makes him younger than me, the scallywag. He attended the University of West Florida and graduated with a bachelor's degree in journalism in 1974. He found out about the Coral Castle on the television series, remember this one? In Search Of. That was in September of 84. Joe spent 10 years of research at Coral Castle and started writing Waiting for Agnes in February of 1995. It took him 5 years to get the story on paper and almost 4 years to publish it. We'll talk to you about that in a second. Joe, how are you? Welcome back.
Thank you so much, George. It's a pleasure to be back.
My pleasure indeed. And Coral Castle, I'm telling you, over the years that we've talked to you and some other people have gone out there, still captures everybody's imagination, Joe.
George, there's more people coming forth now. I was just telling Tom that as I was going back tonight, or this last week preparing for the show, I've got notes spread all over my floor and walls here. So if you hear me scrambling for paper, when you ask me a question, I have found notes and stuff that I made, George, over the years that I had forgotten about even existed, going back to some really weird things. And tonight I want to cover everything, look under every rock, and some of these things I'm going to tell you are strange and weird, but that's why we study Coral Castle.
Well, Joe, we're going to look under every rock. We're going to need Ed Leedskalnin to come back and help us lift some of them, huh?
Yeah, and his anti-gravity machine, if we can figure it out.
Well, before we get into Coral Castle, I want to get you, because, when you were on with me a couple years ago, I did ask you this question, and that was, because you've studied Coral Castle, what is your interpretation of the pyramids, the ones at Giza, and how they were built?
George, I've studied all those things, not with the mind of a scientist, but just trying to figure it out. What would it have taken to build those pyramids? And from what I can determine, and there's a story told of a dead cat that they found inside the pyramid, the Great Pyramid there. He had been dead for something like 20 years, and his body had actually mummified. And they found out the reason was there's a magnetic force that's set up when you set the Great Pyramid on the true north compass. It actually causes a magnetic force to be functioning inside the Great Pyramid. Well, what that magnetic force does, George, is it pulls the water out of the body, which mummified it. So if you really look at the Great Pyramid as a scientific instrument, that's how it was designed. And I believe with all my heart that somehow, and we touched a little on this, that someone came down, because the math involved to do the Great Pyramid, you've got, I'm not, math and science were my worst subjects, and here I am trying to explain the Great Pyramid. But looking at it, the math that's required, that it's set on the geodetic center of the Earth. The Great Pyramid is like, if it was a body, it would be located where the navel is. Someone put that there as a scientific instrument, not as a tomb. And there's evidence now that it is a scientific instrument. And I believe that, as we talked before, someone came in, whether they were Atlanteans, whether they were aliens, someone had the technology to put that thing together that we have lost in time.
Okay, now we go to Coral Castle. We're going to talk about ley lines. We're going to talk about how Leedskalnin moved Coral Castle. But more importantly at this point, Joe, let's talk about the man, Edward Leedskalnin, a frail man, 100 pounds, 5 feet tall, maybe an inch or so higher. Who is this guy? Who was he?
Ed, to start his story off, it begins in Latvia, which borders Russia. Ed was born to a family of farmers, but I found out, I think his his real love and his real knowledge and learning came from his grandfather. You know, usually, George, we inherit some type of talent from some genetic person that we had, whether we come in as a carpenter or a movie star or whatever, something we usually inherit from someone. Ed's father was a farmer, and he grew up in the area there of Latvia, and there's a lot of rock quarries there. And Ed, as a child, was taught by his grandfather. He loved to read. He was sickly as a child. Ed was not able to go out and play like most children too much because he had sort of like asthmatic symptoms. And as you said, he was only 5 feet 100 pounds, and he was a little bit frail. Now, as he grew later on, he got a little more muscular and a little more meat to his bones, but he was a pretty sickly person, so he read a lot of books. And I'm convinced that his grandfather had brought him actually books from all over the place. And now this section in Latvia where he is at, near Riga, which is the capital, he would have had access to a lot of stuff that maybe wasn't, when he came to Homestead, he didn't have the book knowledge that he had. I think he gained a lot of his knowledge as a child in Latvia reading these books because he'd sit in bed when he couldn't go to school, and he actually got, like Einstein, he got bored with school. He actually quit in the 4th grade. Well, when he was 26 years old, because he was sickly, he never dated that much. He fell in love with a girl named Agnes Scuffs. The year was 1912. The Titanic sank, and he's 26, and he meets a 16-year-old girl. The story that I got was he was in the tombstone business, carving tombstones, because that was their business, he and his grandfather. Well, she came in with her mother, you know, wearing a red dress and parasol, just a beautiful girl. Well, he was smitten. Well, it's hard to say, George, because he never explained a whole lot to anybody about the relationship of Agnes and him. And that's one thing I wanted to find out so much in my research. But we don't know how long they dated, but we know they got engaged. They were, in love and ready to be married. Well, the night before the wedding, now I've heard several stories, and several recent stories. I've spoken to some friends in Latvia, and they said, well, some people say that they actually had the church wedding and everything was ready, and she didn't show up at the church. Now, other people say that she sent her cousin by to Ed's home to tell him that she couldn't marry him. Didn't really give him a reason. Some people later on said that he was too poor and too old, but I think later on Ed had sort of made that story up. And so she jilts him the night before the wedding, and he was devastated. Like I said, only girl that he's ever loved. He's just, you know how that first love is, and the rejection just tore him up. So he jumps on a boat, heads to Canada, and starts working in a lumber mill.
So he decides he's leaving that area.
He's got to get out of Latvia. Yeah. Too many memories, and he never sets foot in Latvia again. After he spends about 4 years working in the lumber mill, he starts getting sick and coughing, and he's not sure what's wrong, but he says, I can't take this cold weather anymore. He had actually wanted to honeymoon in Florida years ago. So 1918, he jumps on a boat, comes to Florida to begin a new life. And this is where he's found on the side of the road by a real estate man named Moser. Well, they find George, he's got tuberculosis, and it's at the advanced stage.
Oh, my.
The actual medical report that is in the museum there in Coral Castle, the doctor states, and I got this right out of the book there, it says, Ed, your body is eaten up with tuberculosis.
I had a story just a couple days ago, Joe, with a guy who has tuberculosis, a very, very resistant strain, and they've got him in jail.
Yeah.
To keep him away from people.
It's very contagious. The people who took him in took a big chance. Now, one advantage they had, George, down there, they had porches in the old days, a screen porch, and they left him on the screen porch with plenty of air blowing through, and they think that helped him to recover. But the story I was telling you last time, he actually went out and built a sun couch, mounted it on the wheel bearings of the 1918 Ford truck, and actually spun around in the hot sun from 1 to 3. And there's some other devices that I think he may have used, like a tripod of pyramid poles there to set up that energy thing like we talked about in the Great Pyramid. And when he went back to the doctor 6 months later, he is the only person to beat advanced stage tuberculosis in history.
Remarkable.
His body was totally cured.
So he's in Florida. Where is he? Where specifically?
He actually came to Miami at first, and he hitchhiked down to Florida City, which is about a 40-minute drive from Miami. and the man actually found him in Florida City, and that's where Ed started to build Coral Castle.
All right. How old is he at that time?
He is 26 years old at this time.
All right. He's young.
Young.